The moving truck hadn't even finished backing into my driveway when the HOA president marched over like she owned the street. In 47 seconds she'd call 911 on me for trespassing in my own house. In 3 hours she'd discover I owned her house too. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also like and subscribe for more stories. The moving truck was still backing into my driveway when I saw her coming. She walked across the street like she owned the whole neighborhood, wearing an expensive tennis outfit at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Her blonde hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, and she carried a clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. Everything about her screamed trouble. My name is David Martinez, and I had just bought my dream lake house after selling my software company. At 45, I was finally ready to retire and enjoy the peaceful life by the water that my late wife Emma had always talked about. She had passed away 3 years ago from cancer, and I used the life insurance money along with my business sale to buy this beautiful property on Sunset Lake Drive. What I didn't know was that I was about to meet the neighborhood tyrant, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, the HOA president who had been making everyone's life miserable for the past 8 years. "Excuse me," she called out before she even reached my driveway. Her voice was sharp and demanding. "You cannot park that truck here without proper authorization from the Homeowners Association. This is a clear violation of our community standards." I set down the box I was carrying and turned to face her. The two movers, both experienced guys who had probably seen every kind of neighbor drama, suddenly found reasons to stay busy inside the truck. "Good morning," I said politely. "I'm David Martinez. I just bought this house yesterday. The truck will be gone as soon as we finish moving my things in." She looked at me like I had just told her I was from Mars. "That's impossible. This house belongs to the estate of Robert Chin, and any sale would have required approval from our Homeowners Association board. I'm Patricia Hendricks, HOA president, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no such approval was given." I pulled out my phone to show her the closing documents. "Actually, Mrs. Hendricks, I have all the paperwork right here. The sale was completed yesterday at 3 p.m. through Harbor Title Company. Would you like to see the deed?" She backed away from my phone like it might bite her. "I don't need to see fake documents. Every property sale in Sunset Lake Estates requires HOA approval. Since you don't have it, you're obviously running some kind of scam. I'm calling the police right now." The movers exchanged looks that said they had seen this movie before. One of them, a guy with gray hair and kind eyes, shook his head sympathetically. Mrs. Hendricks pulled out her expensive phone and made a big show of dialing 911, speaking loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Yes, I need police immediately. There's a man at 847 Sunset Lake Drive claiming to own the Chin property. He has a suspicious truck and several accomplices. This appears to be some kind of organized burglary." Accomplices? She was talking about the licensed moving company whose name was painted in huge letters on the side of their truck. While we waited for the police, I noticed other neighbors coming out to watch. An elderly man across the street gave me a small wave that seemed to say, "Welcome to our nightmare." A woman walking her dog looked embarrassed by the whole scene. A middle-aged couple stood on their porch shaking their heads in frustration. Officer Johnson arrived about 15 minutes later. He stepped out of his patrol car with the tired expression of someone who had dealt with Mrs. Hendricks before. His shoulders actually sagged when he saw her standing on my lawn. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said with professional patience. "What's the problem today?" "This man is trespassing and claims to own the Chin property," she announced, pointing at me dramatically. "He has no HOA approval and is clearly running some kind of fraud operation." Officer Johnson looked at me, then at the moving truck with its legitimate business logo, then back at Mrs. Hendricks with barely hidden frustration. "Sir, may I see some identification and any documents you have about this property?" I handed him my driver's license and showed him the closing documents on my phone, including the deed that had been officially recorded with the county that morning. Officer Johnson reviewed everything carefully while Mrs. Hendricks provided running commentary about how criminals were getting more sophisticated these days. "Mr. Martinez," the officer said after a few minutes, "everything looks legitimate here. This is your house and you have every right to be moving in." The look on Mrs. Hendricks' face was priceless. Her mouth opened and closed several times without making any sound, like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible," she finally managed to say. "The HOA has to approve all sales. This must be some kind of mistake that needs immediate investigation." "Ma'am," Officer Johnson replied with barely controlled patience, "Mr. Martinez legally owns this property. Making false reports to 911 is against the law, and if you continue to harass him, you could face charges yourself." But Mrs. Hendricks was not the type of person who accepted defeat easily. She straightened up to her full height and delivered what she clearly thought was a devastating blow. Fine. But as HOA president, I'm putting you on official notice, Mr. Martinez. You may have somehow acquired this property, but you will follow every single rule and regulation in our community guidelines. I'll be watching every move you make, and the first violation will result in immediate fines. This house has been empty for 6 months, and I'm sure there are numerous violations that need attention. After Officer Johnson left with a warning to Mrs. Hendricks about making false reports, I noticed something interesting. Several neighbors approached me with apologetic looks. "I'm sorry about Patricia," said the elderly man from across the street, introducing himself as Frank Wilson. "She's been making life difficult for everyone here for years. Most of us are too afraid to stand up to her because she controls the HOA board and has connections with local lawyers." "How bad is it?" I asked. Frank laughed bitterly. "Last month she fined the Johnson family $500 because their garbage can was visible from the street for 3 hours on non-pickup day. She once made a family repaint their entire house because the color was not in keeping with community standards, even though it was the same color as 5 other houses on the street." A younger woman named Sarah Chin, no relation to the previous owner, added, "She's fined people for having their children play outside after 6 p.m., for parking guests' cars in their own driveways, and for having Christmas decorations up 1 day past her arbitrary deadline. We've tried to vote her out 3 times, but she always finds ways to invalidate the elections or intimidate people into not running against her." As I listened to their stories, I realized that this quiet lakeside community was being terrorized by one person's ego and power trip. What none of them knew was that over the past 6 months, while I was planning my retirement, I had been quietly purchasing properties in this neighborhood through various business entities. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. According to Mrs. Hendricks, I was being fined $200 for unauthorized moving activities during restricted hours. The moving truck had been there from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, hardly restricted hours by any reasonable standard. By lunchtime, I had received 3 more violation notices. One for having my garbage cans visible from the street, even though they were behind my car in my own driveway. Another for excessive noise, though I had been quietly unpacking boxes. The third was for failure to maintain approved landscaping standards, because the previous owner's rose bushes apparently weren't on some approved plant list. That afternoon, Mrs. Hendricks went door to door with a petition demanding my immediate removal from the neighborhood. I watched from my window as she tried to rally support, but most people either weren't home or made excuses about needing to think about it. Mrs. Wilson, Frank's wife, actually laughed when Mrs. Hendricks showed up at her door. I couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. Mrs. Wilson was having none of it, and when Mrs. Hendricks tried to push her way closer to the door, the elderly woman threatened to call the police herself. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to get familiar with my new home. Sunset Lake Drive was actually beautiful when you looked past the drama. 40 houses total, 20 on each side of the street, all facing the lake with a private beach at the end that was supposedly maintained by the HOA fees. Several neighbors were outside and most gave me friendly waves. A few stopped to introduce themselves and apologize for Mrs. Hendricks' behavior. "She wasn't always this bad," explained Janet Peters, who lived 4 houses down. "When she first became HOA president, she actually did some good things like organizing community events and keeping the beach clean. But power went to her head, especially after her husband's medical practice became really successful. Now she treats the HOA like her personal kingdom." I filed away all this information and continued my walk, making mental notes about each property. Some houses were clearly vacation homes, empty most of the time with that unlived-in look. Others were rental properties with different cars coming and going. A few were permanent residences like mine, where families actually lived year-round. What struck me most was the potential this community had. The lake was gorgeous, the houses were well-built, and most of the people seemed decent. They just needed someone to stand up to the neighborhood bully. The next morning brought a new level of harassment. I found my entire front yard decorated with orange violation notices stuck to everything: my mailbox, my car, every tree, even the garden decorations that came with the house. It looked like some kind of bizarre art installation. Mrs. Hendricks had also called another emergency HOA meeting, and I could see about 20 neighbors gathered in her driveway listening to her rant through a portable microphone. "This man represents a clear threat to our way of life," she was saying as I walked outside to collect my mail. "He's shown complete disregard for our rules and community standards. I've discovered he's some kind of tech entrepreneur who probably made his money through questionable means. Actually, I had made my money by creating cybersecurity software that protected small businesses from hackers, but why let facts interfere with a good story? I propose we take immediate action, she continued. A special assessment of $3,000 per household to create a legal fund to force this disruptive element out of our community. $3,000. I could see the shock on people's faces. Most families here were comfortable but not wealthy. $3,000 was serious money to spend on harassing a neighbor who had done nothing but buy a house and move in. Frank Wilson found his courage and spoke up. Patricia, that's ridiculous. We can't charge people $3,000 just because you don't like the new neighbor. He hasn't actually done anything wrong. Hasn't done anything wrong? She shrieked. He's refused HOA inspection, accumulated over $2,000 in fines, and is probably planning to turn his property into some kind of party house that will destroy our property values. I decided this was the perfect time to make an appearance. I walked over to the group carrying the stack of orange notices I had collected from my yard. Good morning, everyone, I said pleasantly. Mrs. Hendricks, I wanted to return these to you. Littering is actually illegal in this state, and I've documented everything for the sheriff's department. Her face went through several color changes before settling on an unhealthy shade of purple. Those are official HOA violation notices, not litter. Actually, they're harassment, I replied calmly. None of them are legally valid since this property predates the HOA formation by 15 years and was never actually included in the original covenant. But please continue your meeting. I'm particularly interested in the part where you're trying to extort $3,000 from each household for a personal vendetta. The crowd was getting restless now, and I could see people starting to whisper among themselves and ask questions. Harold Hendricks, Mrs. Hendricks' husband and the HOA treasurer, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Patricia, maybe we should verify the property boundaries before we collect any special assessments. She turned on him like an angry snake. Harold, don't you dare undermine me in front of everyone. Every property in Sunset Lake Estates is part of the HOA. But if he's right about his house, someone in the crowd started to say. He's not right about anything. Mrs. Hendricks screamed, completely losing her composure. This man is trying to destroy our community. Can't you see that? I pulled out my phone and pretended to check an email. Oh, this is interesting. I just heard back from my attorney who's been researching the HOA's legal authority. Apparently, there are actually 12 properties in this neighborhood that were never legally included in the homeowners association. 12 properties that have been paying fees and fines for years without any legal obligation to do so. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was staring at Mrs. Hendricks, who looked like she had been hit by a truck. You're lying, she said, but her voice had lost all its conviction. County property records are public information, I said. Anyone can verify what I'm saying. In fact, I encourage everyone here to check when your house was built, when the HOA was formed, and whether your deed actually mentions HOA membership. You might be surprised by what you find. People were already pulling out their phones, and I could see the panic in Mrs. Hendricks' eyes. Her carefully constructed kingdom was starting to crumble. This meeting is over, she announced quickly, grabbing her microphone. I need to consult with legal counsel about these baseless accusations. But people weren't leaving. They were gathering in small groups, comparing notes, asking questions. I heard someone say they had never actually seen a copy of the HOA charter. Another person mentioned they had been trying to get financial records for years without success. Frank Wilson walked over to me with the first genuine smile I had seen from him. That was beautiful. I haven't seen her that flustered in years. This is just the beginning, I said. Mrs. Hendricks is about to discover that bullying people has consequences, especially when you're bullying someone who owns half the neighborhood. What do you mean? Frank asked. I smiled. Let's just say that Mrs. Hendricks is about to face the biggest surprise of her life. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood grapevine about the property research I had suggested. People started checking their deeds and county records, and the results were eye-opening. Not only were 12 properties never legally part of the HOA, but several families discovered they had been paying fees and fines they never actually owed. Mrs. Hendricks tried to maintain control by issuing more violation notices and threatening legal action, but her authority was crumbling fast. When she tried to fine the Johnson family for having a birthday party that went past 8 p.m., they told her to go pound sand. When she attempted to cite the Peters family for their hedge being 2 inches too tall, they laughed in her face. The breaking point came when she tried to have my car towed from my own driveway, claiming it was parked illegally. The towing company looked at her paperwork, then at the deed I showed them and told her they wouldn't touch the car. She was so frustrated she actually threw her clipboard on the ground and stormed off like a child having a tantrum. That evening, I received a visit from Harold Hendricks. The poor man looked exhausted and embarrassed as he stood on my porch. "Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've let my wife's behavior get completely out of control. She's been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, and I've been too weak to stop it." "It's not too late to make things right," I told him. "Actually, it might be," he said sadly. "I've been looking into the HOA finances like you suggested, and there are some serious problems. Over the past 5 years, we've collected about $400,000 in fees and fines, but I can only account for about $150,000 in actual expenses. The rest seems to have disappeared into consulting fees and legal expenses that I never authorized." This was exactly what I had expected to hear. "Harold, I think you need to call the State Attorney General's office. What you're describing sounds like embezzlement." His face went pale. "I was afraid you'd say that. Patricia has been handling all the financial records herself. She said it was easier than involving the whole board." The next morning, Harold filed a formal complaint with the Attorney General's office requesting an investigation into the HOA's finances. Within hours, Mrs. Hendricks received a letter informing her that all HOA financial records were being seized pending a full audit. Her reaction was predictable. She called another emergency meeting, this time screaming about how I had corrupted her husband and was trying to destroy the neighborhood through lies and legal manipulation. But this time only about 8 people showed up, and most of them were there to demand answers about the missing money. "Where is our money, Patricia?" demanded Sarah Chin. "We've been paying $150 per month for years, plus all those fines. What happened to it all?" "The financial records are being audited by hostile forces," Mrs. Hendricks replied, sounding more desperate by the minute. "This is all part of Mr. Martinez's scheme to take over our community." "Take over the community?" Frank Wilson laughed. "Patricia, the man just wanted to move into his house peacefully. You're the one who started this whole mess by calling the cops on him for the crime of existing." That's when I decided it was time to reveal the full extent of my position. I had been waiting for the right moment, and Mrs. Hendricks had finally pushed things far enough. "Actually," I said, stepping forward from where I had been quietly observing, "I should probably mention something. Over the past 8 months, I haven't just bought one house in this neighborhood. I've purchased 12 properties total, all through different business entities." The silence was complete. You could have heard a pin drop. "I own the 7 rental houses on the north side of the street, the 3 vacation homes that sit empty most of the year, the old Murphy place that's been vacant for 2 years, and as of last week, I also purchased the mortgage on Mrs. Hendricks' house when her bank decided to sell the loan." Mrs. Hendricks' face went completely white. "That's impossible. Our mortgage is with First National Bank." "It was," I said calmly. "But banks sell mortgages all the time. Your loan was part of a package deal I acquired through Martinez Property Holdings, LLC. Harold, you might want to check your mail. There should be a letter there explaining the ownership transfer." Harold looked like he might faint. "You mean?" "I mean that Mrs. Hendricks has been threatening and harassing her own landlord for the past 2 weeks. Every violation notice, every illegal fine, every attempt to intimidate me has been documented and can now be grounds for mortgage acceleration or foreclosure proceedings." The crowd was stunned. Mrs. Hendricks opened and closed her mouth several times without making any sound. "Why?" asked Janet Peters. "Why would you buy so many houses?" "Originally, I just wanted a quiet place to retire," I explained. "But when I researched this neighborhood, I kept hearing stories about the HOA president who made everyone's life miserable. I discovered she was collecting illegal fees, bullying people into paying fines they didn't owe, and using her position to line her own pockets. So I decided to do something about it." Frank Wilson started to laugh and soon others joined in. It wasn't mean-spirited laughter but the kind of relieved, cathartic laughter that comes from watching a bully finally get their comeuppance. Mrs. Hendricks tried to rally one last time. "This is all illegal. You can't just buy people's mortgages and take over a neighborhood." "Actually, it's completely legal," I said. "And I'm not taking over anything. I'm just ensuring that property owners are treated fairly and that HOA rules are actually based on real legal authority instead of one person's ego." Over the next month, the neighborhood transformation was remarkable. The Attorney General's investigation found that Mrs. Hendricks had indeed embezzled nearly $250,000 in HOA funds over 5 years. She was arrested and charged with multiple felonies. The illegal fines were canceled and people who had paid them received refunds. The 12 properties that were never legally part of the HOA stopped paying fees they never owed. A new legitimate HOA was formed with proper oversight and financial transparency, focused on actual community improvement rather than petty harassment. I sold most of the properties I had purchased to families who wanted to live in a peaceful neighborhood, keeping only 3 as rental investments with reasonable, respectful lease terms. Mrs. Hendricks and Harold ended up losing their house through foreclosure and moved out of state. I heard later that she was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the community. 6 months after that first day when she called 911 on me for moving into my own house, we held the first annual Sunset Lake Community Festival. The event was held on the private beach, which we had restored using some of the recovered funds from Mrs. Hendricks' embezzlement. Everyone brought food to share, kids played in the lake, and neighbors who had been afraid to talk to each other for years finally relaxed and enjoyed their community. Frank Wilson raised a toast that captured the mood perfectly, to David Martinez, who proved that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to buy their house and show them what real community leadership looks like. As the sun set over Sunset Lake that evening, I thought about Emma and how much she would have loved this gathering. She always said that the best communities were built on mutual respect and kindness, not fear and intimidation. Mrs. Hendricks had called 911 to report me for trespassing in my own driveway. She ended up in handcuffs while I ended up owning half the neighborhood and helping restore peace to a community that had been terrorized for years. Sometimes justice doesn't just come around, it buys real estate and serves eviction notices. And sometimes the best revenge really is living well, especially when you can help 40 other families live well too. The lake was calm that evening, reflecting the lights from all the houses along Sunset Lake Drive. Each house was different, each family unique, but for the first time in years, they were united in something positive rather than shared fear. They were finally free to enjoy the beautiful community they had always deserved, and that freedom came from the most unlikely source, a retired software developer who just wanted to move in peacefully but ended up liberating an entire neighborhood instead. As I sat on my deck that night, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, I realized that sometimes life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you need to be, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right resources to make a difference. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks had thought she was dealing with just another new neighbor she could intimidate and control. Instead, she had picked a fight with someone who had the means, the motivation, and the legal knowledge to end her reign of terror once and for all. The moving truck that started this whole adventure was long gone, but the changes it brought to Sunset Lake Drive would last for generations. Sometimes the smallest actions, like buying a house and trying to move in peacefully, can have the biggest consequences. And sometimes the person who calls 911 on you for existing ends up learning that karma doesn't just knock on your door, it buys your mortgage and becomes your landlord.